And with that, I am going to call the debate to order. Resolved, be colorblind. Could we please have our first speaker, Mr. John Wood, take the stage?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to everybody who's come out this evening. I really, really do appreciate it. And yeah, never a bad time at a Brave Angels debate. So I am speaking in the affirmative, resolved, be colorblind. And I really do think that it is the right principle to employ in matters of both public policy and personal relationships, really. I think that, for example, it helps to ground this in a bit of a policy item. It's easy to look at affirmative action as a non-colorblind policy, something that existed to sort of balance the scales of inequity in terms of opportunity in this country for people of color. But if you look at the majority of admittance from the broadly defined Black community and campuses and universities, it's my understanding that a majority of them are from middle-class backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds, which means that they are not historically suffering necessarily from the most grievous impacts of systemic racism in America's past. We can go through these sorts of examples on just sort of a personal level. When you make friends with somebody, when you have a relationship with somebody, well, as Dr. King said, you want to judge them by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. Now, having said that, I don't want to suggest that there's no nuance to this question. And there's a way in which I'm sort of a soft yes on the resolution, because race is correlated to many things in the context of American life. When it comes to things relevant to public policy, while I do believe that class is a better indicator or a better metric to use in matters of proactive public policy, it's definitely true that race correlates to class in very in strongly overlapping ways. And so it's not unreasonable that we should look at these things. And race can have its impact in social circumstances. It can be good to understand the culture of the person you are speaking to. That is very likely to correlate to race in some sense. And depending on the color distribution of people in the room, you may or may not want to repeat all of your favorite lyrics from your favorite rap song. And so, there are ways in which we want to be nuanced and sensitive to the ways in which color may factor in, at least adjacently, to concerns that we may have from a policy vantage point or a social vantage point. But at the end of the day, race is neither an absolute determinant of where we stand on the distribution of opportunity and privilege in American society, or who we are with respect to our quality as human beings. And given that that is the fact, I do rise today, Mr. Chair, in support of the resolution.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we're going to take a couple of questions. Ms. Brenda Burlett.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The person that just presented.
Please address the chair.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. The speaker who just spoke mentioned that he thought that the possibility of class as being a better distinction than race. I wonder if he would expand on that a little bit.
Sure, I'm very happy to speak to the questioner's question. And yes, so it's not the only, but one of the most pernicious effects of systemic racism in American society historically has been its resulting inequality along economic lines that is produced in even contemporary American life in a way that to a significant degree overlaps with race, but is ultimately distinct from race. So there are millions of poor white people in America who live much more difficult economic lives than I do. And I'm African-American, half African-American, but I'm African-American. And myself and the black side of my family, we are mostly middle class, right? If part of the impulse behind proactive social policies to lift up people who need greater opportunity, there'll be something a little bit perverse potentially about putting policies in place that just on the basis of race wind up elevating people like myself who don't really need it, while leaving many other people who do need it behind on account of race. And so that's the sort of dynamic that I'm getting at with that statement.
Right, I think we have a little bit of extra time here, so I'm going to go ahead and take one more questioner. I see Mr. Solomon Gibson, the third. Oh, Solomon, you're muted. There you
Uh,
go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as a middle-class African-American myself, but older, I can say there has been quite a bit of influence in what this country has done. But my question is a bit subtler because I can see this as always kind of an underlying issue in discussing this, is since the speaker mentioned this, does he see a differentiation between race and color?
Mm. Well, that's the questioner asks a great question. And honestly, I think that it is somewhat context dependent here because race, like so many other terms, including ethnicity, um, people will use the same word in different ways to correlate to different things. To my mind, the way I would typically use the term race is not as directly equating to you and I on a facial level. Phenotypically, we are not, in point of fact, the same color, myself and the questioner. But particularly given the socially constructed nature of race, and especially in a specifically American context, we are both black, right? Me and the questioner are both black. We are both the same race. But again, it is socially constructed. And so no, I don't think that the terms are interchangeable in any absolute or ultimate sense, but I do recognize the fact that they are sometimes used that way. And I think a person just has to be discerning as to what people mean, what they mean by these terms when engaging in conversation.
Right. And with that, let's please thank our opening speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And now,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you. And now we're going to be looking for a speech in the negative. I see Mr. Luke Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate everything that Mr. Wood said just now, and everything that everybody who speaks in defense of colorblindness later tonight is going to say, because I think they all operate in good faith, and I think what they believe of themselves as talking about when they talk about colorblindness is fundamentally a good and noble ideal, and it probably is basically a good way to treat your personal life and to treat most matters of public life too. I don't dispute any of that, and I have just as much contempt and fear of all forms of radical identitarianism and deep racism and all this IQ-based skull measuring stuff that the neo-racists nowadays are constantly pouring into our brains on the internet. It's bad, it's ugly, it's stupid, most of it's objectively wrong. Don't do it. And yet, I think we are kidding ourselves if we were to suggest that race, while existing, didn't have a meaningful and perhaps irreversibly meaningful impact on how each and every one of us, including those of us who consider ourselves to be colorblind, understand the world and interact with everybody else in the world. Now, that's not to say that race is the ultimate prime factor any more than religion or class or political identity or geography or gender is the ultimate factor. But it is a factor that meaningfully shapes a lot of our experiences. And it should be weighed and taken as seriously as all of those. I have seen a lot of the argument in the past that if we simply stopped talking about race, then we would no longer have problems of race. And I just don't think that's true. I think the big question here that I'm interested in is most significantly not should you treat people differently on the basis of race or color or ethnicity or anything like that. For me, the big question at stake here is there essential kind of like communitarian sovereignty that emerges from people who believe that they're the same on some measure or other, acknowledging each other to be the same and that they have a shared collective destiny or understanding that other people don't. And if they do have that sovereignty, should they have the right to acknowledge it and to be treated a certain way for it and to govern themselves in some sense according to it? And I think if we believe anything that we say we believe about Alexis de Tocqueville, about communitarian democracy, about all this kind of stuff, the obvious answer is yes. That doesn't mean that you have to have a Filipino seat on city council. That doesn't mean you have to have certain quotas for college admissions. That doesn't necessarily mean those. But I think it really does obviously mean that history for Black Americans and Asian Americans and white Americans is just as diverse and distinct and subtly different, perhaps harmonious, perhaps not, as it is for American Democrats and American Republicans and American independents and everything else like that. And I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. We are very blessed to be in a country that imagines itself to be an idea, which has a system of government that doesn't force everybody to be the exact same, doesn't force everybody to be a mere dollar sign on the market or a mere thing that the law looks at as the same as every other human being. We're allowed to have our identities. We're allowed to have many identities, and our system allows that diversity to swirl and form and mix and meld and preserve the liberty of every other part by its very nature. I think that by hoping for a universal standard of colorblindness that does not do a true service to the fact that all of us have complicated identities, and my mom's background and my dad's background are about as different as anybody else's could be, and yet they managed to make it work. I think we are denying ourselves something that we actually are. And I'm interested in exploring this with everybody over the course of the night. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Everybody, please thank the speaker. Thank you, Mr. Phillips. And now we're going to enter a period of questioning. Let's see. I see some hands that I haven't seen before somewhere. I'm seeing Mr. Paul Polk. Mr. Polk?
Yes, specifically to the two speakers, I would like to hear their definitions of color blindness.
Mr. Chair, I think John and I have a very similar definition here, so I won't. Although I don't claim to speak for him, but the bag that I'm punching is the bag that I think he is holding, and it's the idea that you shouldn't treat anybody in policy or in your personal life any differently from anybody else on the basis of what their racial, ethnic, or color background is. That the law should be as blind as the market, and that you should be as blind as the law and the market in a very significant sense.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Polk, and thank you, Luke. I'm seeing also Mr. Wood.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Chair, and I do have a question for the speaker, and he gave a compelling case. My question is this, Mr. Chair, the speaker seemed to argue that the communal solidarity that comes with racial fraternity is a positive thing, and that if we admire and agree with the teachings of Alexis de Tocqueville and others, we would see the value in this. My question for the speaker is, are there not cases in which racial solidarity, even if it lends itself to a sense of community, is not also, in fact, pernicious? And if it is the case that there are times in which racial solidarity can be pernicious, and we could think of various white nationalist movements, for instance, as an example of this, but there are others, of course, does that not undermine his argument?
I think that's completely right. And if you're serious about, and this is not you referring to John, this is just the general vague abstract you that all of us are, right?
Thank you.
if you're serious about the idea of solidarity, solidarity doesn't matter if it's not something that can possibly be exclusive and pernicious as well. It doesn't have to by nature be exclusive and pernicious, but for it to actually be like power, it is. And so, yeah, it's possible that everybody who has ethnic pride could be a racist. They don't have to be, but it's possible. Now, the reason I'm insistent that the American system of Federalist 10 style pluralism on the one hand, and partisan bipolarity style mix and meld everything into a big coalition that doesn't make sense anymore. On the other hand, the reason why I think that is the saving grace of American race relations, if we could get past the black-white dynamic that our Southern cousins enforced on us in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, that just destroyed everybody's minds by making race a black and white thing rather than an ethnicity thing. If we could get past that, I think there's a very, very real reality that we have everything we need in the system of coalitions and balances and really big groups of people that don't have anything in common and yet think that they're the same, right? That we could have the incredible diversity, including the pernicious parts of it, and not have it be meaningfully destructive the way white nationalism and every other ethno-nationalism and ethno-identitarianism in its left-wing styles now. We could have everybody's identity and have it be meaningful without having it be so constantly about to upset the apple cart and destroy the racial discourse. And I think there are ways that happens in some parts of the country already. So yeah, I think I think the conflict is there, but I think the answer is in the system, not in a change of understanding of how of what we are.
Right. Let's all give another round of jazz hands for Luke and for our questioners. Thank you guys very much. I'm now looking for another speech in the affirmative. I see Joe Nalvin.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to approach it somewhat differently. If you know, in Ireland, between the Catholics and the Protestants, it's not a question of being colorblind. If you go into Hotel Rwanda, you saw it was between the Hutus and the Tutsis. It was not a question of being colorblind. So really the question is about human nature. And I will approach it from the point of view of human nature. And accidentally, ours happens to be on the issue of race sometimes. I'd also like to look at the term colorblind. But first, if you go out and say it's raining cats and dogs, my 3-year-old went to the window and said, "No, Daddy, it's not raining cats and dogs." It's not a literal term. Colorblind is not literal term understood that way. So to argue it that way, I think is simplistic. Rather, I'd like to focus on the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's present in one form or another in Confucianism, Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Baha'i. So there are many institutional frameworks that we have with treating others with respect is called the golden rule. So being colorblind is kind of a detour from that. So I had a student in one of my classes in cultural anthropology, and she was a Black female, and we were talking about this subject, and she said, well, if I meet a white supremacist, well, that's his problem. It's not my problem. So don't treat yourself as a victim. So again, I'm looking at it from this kind of personal dimension of dealing with sometimes what others were talking about here, I think more of a social dimension. Also, I'd like to quote from Shelby Steele, if we look at the broader dynamic. And he was a radical in his youth, and now he's more of a seasoned elder. He pointed out, he said, the oppression of Black Americans is over with. Yes, there are exceptions. Racism won't go away. It is endemic to the human condition, just like stupidity. But the older form of oppression is gone. Before, it was a question of Black unity and protest. No more. It is up to us now as individuals to get ahead. Our problem now is not racism. Our problem is freedom. So when we're debating be colorblind, we may be taking our eye off the target about what each of us needs to do, what the community needs to do in terms of moving forward. This is not 1619. We have made a lot of progress since the 1960s, and there's been a lot of attitudinal and behavioral change. Let's move from today's present rather than being locked into a past which doesn't exist right now and hopefully doesn't return. Those are my comments.
All right, thank you, Mr. Nalvin. All right, we'll now be taking questions. Any questions for the speaker? Oh, Brenda, I see your hand again.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, because this is such an important topic. I would wonder if the professor, the previous speaker, would be definitive. He said it's time for us to move on. I wonder if he could be definitive in some concrete ways that we might be able to move on.
Well, I'll give you an example. Back in the 1950s and early 1960s, before the Supreme Court decision Loving versus Virginia, only about 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Now it's over 90% approve of it. So there's no point of even asking the question anymore, even though obviously there's some pockets that don't. But we have made major changes, and that's the point at which we should start from. Of the change, not as if it was back in 1950.
All right, thank you very much, Brenda. Thank you again, Mr. Nalvin. I'm seeing also Richard, your hand up. Oh, you're muted. Should be a button right down at the bottom of your Zoom window. Unmute.
How about there?
Oh, there we go.
Okay. You wouldn't know that I participate in several Zoom meetings a week and still am not terribly familiar with it and have done that for several years. Anyway,
That's okay.
with that disclaimer in mind, Mr. Chair, is it improper for me to pose a question to the first two speakers? Oh,
Yes, we'll only be taking a question for the present speaker at this time.
okay, I'll hold it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gibson, I'm seeing your hand again as well.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I was particularly struck about the moving on aspect of what the speaker was referring to. And one of the analogies I have always seen in this issue has been, well, essentially it's always been talked about how we're not where we were in the past, and a lot of things have just disappeared, how much we've improved, and that improvement seems to imply still not being hamstrung with what was done before. My analogy in question is based on the notion of a two-team relay race. And that, does the speaker think it is enough that if you've hamstrung one team, that simply the removal of those shackles without corrective measures makes it a fair race, that both teams have an equal opportunity to advance in and compete with one another at an
Right,
equal level?
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Mr. Nalvin?
Yeah, I've seen that comparison before, and I would agree with you that a lot of that handicapping is a question of time sensitive and context. And I was being a little provocative by saying you need to move on. I'm coming from point of view of, say, being Jewish, where we have a 2,000-year-old problem of anti-Semitism, and it's hard to move on. We just saw it exploding all over again. So it's more of a hope that that we can move on, but sometimes, like you point out, there are real-world situations which just says, no, you cannot.
All right. Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to our questioners as well. Let's get another round of jazz hands in here. Great job, guys. And with that, I'm going to be looking for another speech in the negative. I'm seeing Miss Holly Lance.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, what a challenging topic this is. And thank you for asking me to speak against the resolution. Being colorblind assumes that we live in a post-race world where race no longer matters, where we can avoid discussing racism and discrimination. We aren't there. Is colorblind the same as implicit bias? And I ask that because I have some familiarity with my own implicit bias. And I think there's some similarities here. I participated in a workshop which helped me understand explicit bias, which is attitudes of behaviors or attitudes and in the conscious. Implicit bias, attitudes and beliefs in the unconscious. This would be like being colorblind, if I'm reading the definition of colorblind right. When Obama was elected president, my implicit bias about intelligence and race became explicit. I became aware of my bias that Black people are not as smart as white people. I carried this, but I didn't see it. I didn't recognize it. It was just within me. I was colorblind. And where did this bias come from? I think in large part my growing up years in Washington, D.C. My parents were professionals. Their friends were white professionals. My doctors were all Jewish. The janitors of our apartment, the janitor in our apartment was Black. White people had professional jobs. Black people were janitors. My implicit bias is finding its way into my being. My grandmother entertained senators and congressmen. She lived near the Capitol. Her Black maid, Weezo, and Weezo's cousin cooked and served meals. They served and removed the plates when my grandmother rang a bell and they did what they were supposed to do. At Christmas, my father, sister, and I brought gifts for the Black folks in the kitchen. I can remember as I went from the dining room to the kitchen, I felt an atmosphere change. We were entering the Black people's space. I didn't belong there. I don't want to stay long. My implicit bias grows deeper. And one more situation, my parents had good friends in Potomac, Maryland, who were wealthy, lived in a large manor house with an indoor pool, had a well-appointed guest house, beautiful gardens, crops, and some sheep. We house sat and dog sat while they went on vacation. In the back of the property, almost hidden by trees and shrubs, was a small cinder block, one-room house where Fulton, the Black caretaker, lived. My sister and I liked visiting Fulton's house, and we wondered about the funny smell and the wood stove. As I reflected back, it reminded me of the slave quarters I visited on the other side of the river at Mount Vernon in Monticello. My conclusion: white people have lots of money, Black people have very little, white people are smarter than Black people. This implicit bias deep within me came out when Obama was declared the winner of the presidential race. I was in a crowd of Democrats. The mayor of Kalamazoo and I had a long hug. I'd worked on his campaign. My implicit bias became explicit. So there's no longer, it's now an explicit. Oh, so I thought to myself, if a Black person can become president of the United States, and if a Black person can be mayor of Kalamazoo, then Black people must be as smart as white people. My explicit bias about race and intelligence is dissolving, and I am not as colorblind. I am conscious of other biases as they move from implicit to explicit, where I can work on them, on reducing them. I hope my story has helped some of you who may have implicit biases deep within you, or maybe on the surface begin to let some of them go. Implicit biases, show yourselves, become explicit, and chase away color blindness. Thank you.
All right. Let's all thank the speaker. Thank you so much. We'll now move into questions. I'm seeing Mr. Craig Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my question for the speaker, and by the way, I appreciate the speaker's candor in talking about some very difficult issues. So I guess I think what the speaker was saying is that that she sees color blindness as implicit bias. And if the speaker could elaborate a little bit on the difference between, say, that sort of how your experience of implicit bias, and by nature of explaining all that, you've defined
how they're experiencing implicit bias.
Yeah, the speaker has implied that, and related to the other definition of color blindness, which is in policy and in personal interaction, that you're not making the focus of that interaction be about race. It seems to me like there are two different things that the speaker could elaborate on that difference if she understands my question.
All right, thank you for your question, Mr. Diamond.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think color blindness is similar to implicit bias. Is that what you think I said?
Yeah, Mr. Questioner, if you could please try to make your question a little more concise for us.
Mr. Chair, could the speaker comment on how her experience of implicit bias being colorblindness compared to the way that, say, Mr. Wood sort of defined colorblindness? I hope that's better.
Ms. Speaker, is that clear for you?
Well, I'm trying to. I took a few notes when John was speaking, but it doesn't. Why
don't we come back to that concept later?
We'll move on to another question for a second, and maybe you can reformulate that, and we'll revisit this in a moment.
Okay.
I'm seeing Luke Phillips again.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if, or Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if the speaker believes that there are any circumstances where implicit or even explicit bias can be a positive and good and wholesome thing.
I would think a bias isn't necessarily negative. I don't think. I think we could all define situations in which we have a bias toward good things happening, or the process that Braver Angels is using to help people who don't agree with each other get together. I have a bias towards Braver Angels. I talk about it all the time when I can. It's what a wonderful program, this organization this is. That's a bias. So yes, I think a bias can be either positive or negative. I have to look it up in the dictionary or Wikipedia and see what they say.
All right. Well, let's thank the speaker again and our questioners. Following schedule here, I think we're going to go ahead and move on. I just want to remind everybody, if you would like to speak, that you can go ahead and chat the whip who has your letter, and tell them that you want to speak and what you want to say. You can chat them directly and let them know that, so that we can give you a chance to speak. I am looking at this time for, and I think we're going to continue just a little bit for 4 minutes with 4-minute speeches, just so you all know. We're looking for another speech now in the affirmative, and I am seeing our Zoom whip, Mrs. Jessie Ministo. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to start with a story that explains how I have come to see this, being a member of the millennial generation. So I have a friend who has a white father and a mother from one of the Pacific Island nations. And her father had terminal cancer, so she decided to go see a therapist to deal with fear and grief. And her therapist wanted to steer the conversation in a different direction. Had my friend ever considered that she might be oppressed because of her Pacific Island heritage? I swear I'm not making this up. It sounded absurd to me when I heard it as well. And the therapist was fairly persistent in this, and my friend got so uncomfortable that she decided to give up on therapy entirely. And I know she's really proud of her heritage. She's taught me about it. It's really interesting. It's an important part of her. But it hadn't really been salient to her in that way. And safe to say, like what she told me is like this wasn't what she went to therapy looking for. She looked to deal with the very broad human universal struggle of suffering and mortality and pain that all humans feel. So that's the kind of thing that I have in mind when I think about this, and how my views that I've been raised with have seemed more and more right the more I hear. I was raised to be colorblind by parents who grew up in the city of Detroit in the 1960s, when, of course, in 1967, there was a terrible riot or rebellion, whichever word you prefer to use. And so I was taught to be colorblind. Now, I want to touch on this, the semantics for a moment, because the word means so many different things, as we're going to hear tonight. Some people are trying to use a new word, racelessness. If you don't know the work of Dr. Sheena Mason, creator of the theory of racelessness, look her up. You came to this debate tonight for a reason, so you might find her work interesting. But I don't think the argument is really over whether we truly see color or not. It's about how we approach this difference, whatever word we use for it. And what's really scaring me are those who are using this this immutable characteristic, not and the very real shame of racism, which still exists, and the shame of our nation's racial crimes, ending not with slavery, but through Jim Crow and redlining and voter suppression and the Japanese internment and discrimination that still exists today, which deserves to be condemned fully. And we're using it now when we talk about colorblindness and race and all these things to talk about something that's not quite that, as I've seen, as my friend going to the therapist will show, especially I think in younger generations. So when I talk about being colorblind, I'm talking about not that I ignore the legacy of these wrongs that I just described, but that I don't want to embrace the distinctions that those may have left between people. When I say I'm colorblind, what I mean is that I refuse to exclude any citizen or even any aspiring immigrant who wants to be an American from American nationhood because of racial or ethnic identity. That's all I'm saying when I say that. I'm very interested in what people hear when I say that, and I'm glad we have conversations like the one we're having here tonight. It certainly doesn't mean I don't think that your ethnicity or race doesn't matter, right? And that it hasn't shaped you. I do also want to particularly reject the idea of this white identity that is bubbling up when we talk about, well, we can't be colorblind. Everyone has this racial identity. I'm really scared that by deviating from a colorblind aspiration in our culture, especially seeing the left deviate it from it based on, which is different from what the left used to do, we're only going to make white identity into something more enticing for people who are aggrieved with perhaps the same universal human suffering that their Black or Asian brothers and sisters could also relate to. But they're not people of color. So I don't want to see that happen. I'm really scared of white identity becoming salient in a way that we'll all regret. So I think if we drop what I'm calling colorblindness and you may call by a different name, I don't think we get more understanding across race. I think we get less, because people stop focusing on their shared humanity and lose those opportunities to share what makes each of us unique individuals, which is, of course, how we connect and belong and include. And by doing that, we come to appreciate our differences. But once we don't let them stop us from connecting. So if I have a moment left, I will tell one other quick story.
A few seconds. Make it quick, please.
What I'll do is I'll end that saying, I was once stopped by a police officer because of the color of my skin, because I lived in Japan, and so I was the outsider there. And it's a funny story to tell right now, right? Because I certainly didn't grow up under that kind of suffering from that, but it made me appreciate how awful that is. And so I'm glad that we were able to tell these stories. when I say I'm colorblind, all I mean is that I can't exclude someone from American nationhood and belonging because of the color of their skin. And I hope we all maintain that and don't double down on identity when it simply divides us and makes us treat each other like outsiders. And I yield to
All
questions.
right. All right. Thank you, Ms. Speaker. I will now open it up to questions. Oh yeah, and jazz hands, please. Thank you. Y'all are better than me. Anyone who hasn't spoken or asked a question would like to ask a question at this time? All right, I'm seeing a hand from Mr. Luke Nathan Phillips.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the speaker's very specific definition of, I think she's trying to keep anybody who wants to say American nationhood is essentially white from being able to be comfortable saying that. And so I appreciate that. I'm wondering if she thinks that there's any validity to non-colorblindness anywhere beneath the level of American nationhood.
For a point of clarification, is the questioner simply asking, is there a place for some kind of racial identity somewhere that doesn't have to do with belonging as an American?
Yes, including political things, but not necessarily the question of whether you're an American or not.
It is a fair question, and I'm not entirely sure what I think about it. I would not try to ban by policy some kind of some kind of affinity group based on that. What I would instead try to do is address problems, much like our first speaker said, class issues, those sorts of things, and make sure that we're not using race to distract from shared experiences, things like that. Because when we have tried to do this before with things like affirmative action, those sorts of things, and I'm deviating from the questioner's point, I think, but I would just want to be really careful with it. But of course, people are free as private citizens to form whatever type of affiliation they want to form and whatever they find salient. So I would not try to stop that. As a white person, I am scared of white people doing that.
All right. Thanks to the questioner. Do we have anyone else like to ask questions at this time? Richard? You're on mute again.
I was
Okay, there we go.
anticipating you calling for people who wanted to speak in the negative. I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay. Would anyone else, we have a little bit more time here. Would anyone else like to pose another question to the speaker? I'm seeing Harleen Michaels.
You've got it. Yes. And this is for all the speakers. I really like the idea that we treat people individually, and get interested in how their background, their color, whatever has influenced them. But I hear about reparations, and in some instances, it seems ridiculous to do the same thing for everybody or whatever. In other instances, it definitely, I certainly want equal opportunities for us to work on, districts for, what am I trying, entrepreneurial districts or whatever. And I'm wondering if there are other situations like the Tulsa burning that do call for some kind of very specific reparations to those families, or is it too late? So that's kind of for all the speakers. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Michaels. Ms. Speaker?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And I have thought a lot about reparations. If it were possible to figure out who are the descendants of real harms, for instance, what happened in Tulsa is easier than what happened with slavery to trace. I would not object to that because there were real crimes committed against these people. That I think is completely compatible with my what I mean when I say it is good to be colorblind. Colorblindness is an aspiration that we live up to ensure that those crimes are never committed again. But that doesn't mean that I would oppose restitution for wrongs that have been done.
All right. Let's go ahead and thank our speaker and questioners again. Great job, guys. Thank you very much. We're now going to move into 3-minute speeches. So try to And if anybody here wants to speak, please try to shorten down what it is you are thinking you're going to say a little bit. And I am now looking for a speech in the negative on the resolution be colorblind. And I'm seeing Mr. Bill Woodson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. So my thesis is that to suggest that you can see me but not see my race is kind of by definition racist, because what you're suggesting is that if you were to perceive my race when you perceive me, then you'd have to judge me less than. And I think that there's a kind of a flaw in how we've approached this conversation, in that we talk about sort of personally mediated bias versus, more national or global policies like affirmative action and things of that nature. I think that should be dealt with somewhat separately. But I think from a personal mediated standpoint, we trip ourselves up and we get in the way of being able to really understand how unconscious bias, and I compliment Holly Lance for bringing the unconscious bias to the conversation, because we all are subjected to what our culture has taught us about the values associated with race. We all know the paradigm of, Asians are the model minorities, and Black people are good athletes and they're good comedians, but we're not sure about whether they're we've suddenly decided in the last 20 years they can also be good quarterbacks as well as linebackers, and these kinds of things. We all know that. We've all been immersed in that. But we have to use our conscious minds to be able to engage and counter the unconscious biases that we've been exposed to, all of us, Black and white and other identities, through our lives and through American culture. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to offset that with our intellect, to say, well, I may have a visceral feeling about the value of a particular identity, but I need to use my conscious mind to not let that make decisions based on that. I want to speak just really quickly also to the notion that we already use all kinds of visual cues to alter how we engage with others, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. If I'm walking down the street in Washington, D.C., and someone asks me a question about where's the metro station, I'm going to respond to them differently if they're 12 years old versus if they're 50 years old versus if they're 80 years old. If they speak and they ask a question with a heavy German accent, I'm going to presume that they don't know as much about the District of Columbia and how to navigate that than if they speak as someone who gives me a sense that they're more of a local. And we don't have a problem with that. But it's absurd if I'm navigating, if my 5'3" wife is trying to find her husband and she's trying to describe, and they're saying, well, I think I saw a guy and he was wearing a red shirt and he said, hey, it's the 6'4" Black guy. Why can't we use, there's nothing wrong with understanding that someone has an identity, a racial identity. So we have to separate our understanding of identity from our understanding of how we value that identity. And that's how we move forward. Thank you.
All right. Let's please thank the speaker. And we'll now take some questions. All right.
Yeah.
I am seeing Mr. Joe Nalvin.
Yes, in my talk, I led with the concept of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's no race, no colorblindness in that framework. So Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have please address
questions to me as the chair.
Yeah, I would like Mr. Woodson to address the issue of whether, if people take that as a primary way of orienting themselves to the world, the golden rule, whether that conflicts with his approach in terms of being race conscious. I mean, there seem to be just different frameworks. And okay, so anyway, that's my question.
Cool. I appreciate that question. That's a fair question. I love the golden rule. I love even more what I call the platinum rule. I didn't name it, somebody else named it that. And that is to treat others the way that they want to be treated. So if I know, to go back to my analogy, if I know the Washington, D.C. and the metro system like the back of my hand, and if someone asks me the question, where's the subway, where's the red line? And I start speaking to them at that level of information that I have, and they have no idea that there's a red line or a green line or a blue line, I'm not helping them. So I'm saying we should use our understanding of where people are at in an informed, intelligent way, but we should also not be locked into that, because I might start making an assumption that the gentleman with the German accent doesn't know much about the subway system, but he might have lived in DC for 20 years. And so I need to be flexible and not make critical decisions based on my assumptions around where they're starting from. But if I start with the idea of the platinum rule, that I'm trying to connect with you where you are as opposed to where I am, I think I'm going to be a better servant to the community that I'm a part of. Does that make sense?
All right, I think we have time for one more question on this one here. I'm seeing Miss Bonita Singal. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I was wondering whether the speaker could address what I would call the strategic advantages of colorblindness. In other words, does the speaker think that there's a strategic advantage if policies are enacted in a more global way? So, for example, very few people would be against Social Security or Medicare because it benefits the entire society. So just speaking strategically and maybe not necessarily ethically or morally, would colorblindness be a better policy, be better for policy in helping Black people who have not had the advantages, economic advantages that other groups in the society have had?
Thank you for that question. I think that sometimes being quote unquote colorblind or policy neutral, totally free of any understanding of identity, is the best that we can do. I really appreciate the example that was put forward about how difficult it is to come up with a way to ethically do reparations based on connection to slavery. But say, for example, the Tulsa riots, that may be more easily connected because we understand who was impacted by that and we can engage that. So I think that there is a place that sometimes, because of the difficulty of shaping policies that are truly engaging and supporting people where they are and where the history would connect us to that, I think that's the best we can do. But I do think that to assume that there's also many, many cases where policy can be most effective when it does have an understanding of how identity has interacted with opportunity and seeks to mitigate those historical problems.
All right, let's everybody thank the questioner and speaker one more time. Excellent job. Thank you guys so much. And we're going to go ahead and look for another speaker here. I'm looking for a speaker in the affirmative. And I am seeing Mr. Francisco Figueroa. Please forgive me if I mispronounced that. Do we have Francisco here? Okay. All right. I'm seeing Mr. Alan Falk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just starting to realize that, yeah, whatever. When I looked at the question, I ran it through all my personal filters and came up with the idea that I support colorblindness. And it's kind of the way I try to live my life. And I'll talk a little bit here about how and why. Racial characteristics, as some of the other speakers and questioners have beautifully put, the characteristics are often, although not always, visible and apparent. So logically, if it's almost impossible to not notice an obvious racial characteristic. It's out there, you can see it, hear it, whatever. But what happens next? And that's where I talk about color blindness. To judge or label or treat someone differently because of noticing their race or whatever is my definition of racism, whether it means you're more or less nice to them as a result, or more or less anything to them. The flip side of that for me is I believe in and support meritocracy. I want to preface that with what I also call Falk's second law, just for reference. Falk's second law is don't trust generalizations. Now, some of you are going to get the irony of that, but keep that in mind. I do believe in support meritocracy, in that it's pretty much the only way to recognize, differentiate, and reward people who are objectively better at their roles than others in the same fields. To reward or choose winners based on any racial characteristics leads down the rabbit hole of quotas, percentages, representation, and other selections, which will guarantee that any service provided by any person, and that's political, manufacturing, social, whatever, will have a predictable percentage provided by an individual who might not be able to meet the required standards for that job performance. It almost follows necessarily. Like your doctor, dentist, surgeon, law enforcement officer, scientist, engineer, airline pilot, garbage collector, vice president. So that's why I think that the best thing to do is to keep that in mind and avoid your implicit or explicit generalizations which result from those kind of observations. And in that way, I think we'll be a happier society. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with that, we'll bring it to questions.
Don't make them too hard, okay?
I'm seeing Luke. Question from Luke.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. I am wondering if the speaker, I hate to be this guy. I hate to be this guy and ask this kind of question. But I heard a quip about meritocracy once saying, meritocracy is incapable of measuring meaningful merit. And what they said by that was that the idea of meritocracy is only ever training people specifically to do one thing. It never actually creates the excellence of a full, totally embodied social human being that true merit, true excellence is. And so I'm wondering how the speaker thinks about that quip, that concept, and whether like purely technical measures of merit are worth constructing institutions on. If there are like, is technical skill the only human good worth building our systems off of, or are there other goods, or is it just technical skill?
Holy crap, Batman! What a question. That is a wonderful question. I do not mean to imply that meritocracy should only be focused on measuring the one chore you're supposed to be doing. But I think it is important because what I don't want to see happen is people are chosen for a position for reasons other than they have a skill or a knack or whatever to do that job and do it effectively. And I hope I'm getting at the answer to what you meant by your question. Is that close? I'm not sure.
I think so. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would love to follow up with the speaker later on in greater depth.
Absolutely.
All right.
Me too.
Thank you to the questioner. I think we have time for one more question here. I'm seeing Miss Joanne White.
Joan White. Thanks.
Joan,
Thank you.
you have the
Yes,
floor.
Mr. Chair, I have a question for the speaker. So in the case that you have two people equally capable of performing a job, and you can't choose by meritocracy alone, how would you choose? I mean, would it be inappropriate to you to be to not be colorblind in that case? I mean, I'm talking equality versus equity, I think.
That's your question?
So my question is, you seem to be implying, how would you
please direct the
solve that
questions to me
problem?
as the chair, Miss White.
Oh,
Right.
Thank
right,
you.
Mr. Chair. So how would you solve that problem?
It's a good
Mr.
question. It's
Speaker?
one that okay.
Go right ahead.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
It is a really good question. It's a very common question, and I have to run that through my personal filter also. If you have two people vying for a position or interviewing for a job or whatever,
right,
and you can't decide between them, the odds are pretty good that you're a human being and you're going to be faced with that kind of thing frequently. So I don't know what the answer is, but when you brought in the word equity, I'm out of there. Equity to me implies that there's some other measure that this person, on one hand, one of the people on one hand, deserves that job more than the other because of some past history or the way they grew up, or their umpteenth grandfather was a slave or whatever. And that just, I leave the room at that point, because I don't believe in using equity as any kind of measure to make that kind of decision. That to me, that's the rabbit hole you go down to and you can't get back. So if you're human and you're faced with that kind of dilemma, hire both of them and split the job, half time or something like that, or hire one provisionally, give them 6-month trial period, see if they work out in the job, and keep the other one, let them know that's what you're doing. There are a lot of things to possibly work around that, but it's just the human condition. You're going to be faced with that. Hope that helps.
All right. Let's thank our speaker and questioners again. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more 3-minute here, and then we're going to move into 2-minute speeches. I would like to remind everybody that if you would like to speak, to please shoot a message to the whip that is handling your name group, and they will speak to you about having an opportunity to speak. I think I am going to choose, looking for a speech in the negative, and I'm seeing Miss Amy Teutenberg.
Okay, hello. So I would like to say no, but just because even going to be colorblind and pretend that it is not a reality, even going to the Milwaukee County Republican Caucus, where the conservative blacks there reject critical race theory and the idea that they're a victim. When the North Side branch table is all black, living in one of the most segregated cities in the country, we all know why that is. And to pretend otherwise would be downright insulting, especially if I'm speaking to someone over 60 to ask where they grew up. We all know they didn't grow up in Lake Country or Bayview by the lake or on a dairy farm because they weren't allowed to live there. Or to pretend that despite everyone here being a Republican, that the challenges their branch or neighborhood are facing are the same as another rural farming town would just be dumb. And we don't necessarily bring it up and we let them speak about what their community needs. But I think pretending that we all had the same background or opportunities, especially people over a certain age group, would just be even more insulting than acting like that didn't happen.
All right, let's everybody thank the speaker. And we'll now open it up for questions. Right. Anybody who hasn't asked a question or spoken thus far would like to pose a question to the speaker. Mr. Nalvin, have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like Amy to address the issue why she thinks I'm pretending at anything. That's why I'm hearing her.
Mr. Nalvin, please pose your questions to me. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to hear the question about why make an assumption that people are pretending to be what they're not when you're imposing your own projection on them.
That's a good question. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I think to say, could you ask your question and could you explain what you mean by that you're not pretending?
I say, for example, I grew up in a housing project in Brooklyn, and it was all Irish, Italian, and Jewish. And then there was white flight, and then there was the Black community, the Puerto Rican community, and us. So I lived in both of those kinds of situations. And so to impose one or the other is kind of pushing me into a category which doesn't fit.
I would say I wouldn't want to put them in a category, but I wouldn't want to not like be aware of what the reality is or pretend there's not a different reality. Because I just feel like people have reacted more insulted if you were to act as if they also possibly grew up where you did, even though there would not have been a possibility.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Nalvin, for your question. And thank you, Amy, for that skillful answer. Luke, you must be feeling inquisitive tonight.
I just love talking about race, politics, and religion. It's one of my favorite things about Braver Angels. It's giving me the chance to do that. But Mr. Chair, I am reminded that our wonderful speaker tonight has some ancestors who were working class Irish Americans and other ancestors who were working class Italian Americans. Two ethnic groups who at various points in history have been notoriously racist towards each other. And I am wondering if she has just commentary as she thinks back on her own family's experiences in the 19th and early 20th centuries on the transcendence of the things that she's talking about here in the longer term process of American amalgamation. I'm wondering if she thinks that identity matters eternally, or if it's something that ebbs and flows, or if it only matters because we think about it. I'm wondering what she thinks.
That's a good question, and I would like us to not think about it. And things are changing, like our neighborhoods are becoming more diverse and people are moving around. So I think eventually, once we see more equality, I think between the quality of life in different neighborhoods, and people freely move between them, that it would become less of an issue.
All right, everybody, please thank the speaker and questioners. Thank you all so much. We're now going to be looking for another speech in the affirmative. And just a reminder to everybody, we are now on to 2-minute speeches. We're going to have a shorter questioning period as well. So please be concise. I'm looking for a speech in the affirmative. I see here Mr. Jay Verts.
Okay. I am an Asian American. I immigrated to USA in 1959 at an age of 11 years old. When I first arrived in USA, I hardly spoke a word of English, nor was I able to write a word in English. Nevertheless, I studied hard, worked hard, persevered, and received a full academic scholarship to attend university only after 7 years in USA. Graduating from university with aerospace engineering degree, I served the country as a U.S. naval officer during Vietnam War period. After 4 years in service, I went to work for an aerospace company called Pratt & Whitney Aircraft. And I retired in 2013, 11 years ago, as a vice president with a comfortable retirement pension and good nest egg savings. I realized the so-called American dream. I didn't have so-called white privilege, nor was I an underprivileged victim of slavery. In America, anybody can achieve American dream if one studies hard, works hard, and perseveres. The color of skin should not matter, and it should not be used to admit colleges or certain jobs. I am an example. If I can do it, so can anybody else. In August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King said in his I Have a Dream speech, he said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What Dr. Martin Luther King was saying is that if we really want to be free, we need to be colorblind, and we should be judged and rewarded by the contents of our character, what we do, what we accomplish, and not strictly by color of our skin. Therefore, I believe that our affirmative policy should be colorblind, which means that we need to let the best of the best rise to the top. Let me provide you with one example. During our last...
Mr. Speaker, please be quick. If you could finish up quickly here. Thank you.
Yeah, during our last Summer Olympic game in 2020, only 2.8% of USA Olympic team was made up of Asian Americans, and 31% was made up by Black Americans. In this case, Asians were underrepresented and Blacks were overrepresented. However, I have absolutely no complaint. Why? Because our team won more medals than anyone else. That's the way how it should be. Let the best of the best rise to the top. And I hope in 2024 Olympic, that's the way it should be. And that's the way it should be in all activities, business, any endeavor. If we want to compete, be the best, and be the top in the country, in the whole world, that's what we have to be, colorblind. Let the best of the best rise to the top. Thank you.
All right. Let's all thank the speaker. Thank you, Mr. Verts. And with that, we're going to open it up to a quick question. Anybody have questions for the speaker? I'm seeing Mr. Nick Cavuto. You're on mute, Nick.
Yes. Hi. Thanks. It's such a difficult topic. You can really see it from both ways. The last speaker was very inspiring, but I would ask him, what if, the best of the best is an outcome of having the best experiences leading up to that? And, not everyone has the same exposure to those types of experiences that would lead them to be selected for an Olympic team, for a job, for an education. And what would the speaker, how would he answer that question? What do you do if the experiences leading up to that point are not on the same plane?
Mr. Speaker?
Well, obviously, we want to have a level playing field. As far as affirmative action is concerned, I do believe that we all should have level playing field, so we all have that opportunity. To me, equality, affirmative equity means equal opportunity, not equal outcome.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to the questioner, and thanks again to the speaker. All right, we are still, as a reminder to everybody, on 2-minute speeches here. I am now looking for another speech in the negative. I am seeing Miss Helen Christians.
Hi, my name's Helen, and I am speaking in the negative. I honestly believe that human beings cannot be colorblind. We are visual people, and we are social people, and we are always seeking our tribe, and we are always seeking safety. Am I safe? Am I safe? And when we, in our country, unfortunately, extremely unfortunately, I'm 73 years old, and I grew up in a segregated world. I grew up learning to discriminate. That was something I learned. And so we've talked about implicit knowledge. That's your lizard brain. That's your limbic system. That's your implicit biases are unconscious. And I carry those because for the first 20 years of my life, I lived in a very segregated world. That has changed. That's changed. And I'm able to overcome it, but I'm trying to, but it takes my frontal lobe, my knowledge, my reasoning skills as an adult to overcome my implicit biases. And just in closing, when you have a census, we've been talking about African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. Why do whites get to be called whites and not European Americans? We all came from somewhere else. Just using that term whites is already stating privilege because I'm a European American. I'm not white. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for questions now. Ms. Ministo.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the speaker for another courageous statement of her own experience with bias and how she was raised. My question for her is, does she think that if she had been raised differently, or would it be theoretically possible to raise a generation that, while literally seeing color, does not treat it saliently? Is that something that we as human beings could possibly do?
Oh, absolutely. We've been trained to discriminate because of skin color. You little kids, 5, 6-year-olds don't discriminate. They notice it, but they don't discriminate it. And we still, up until just a few years ago, everybody was white on television. Friends in New York City had no people of color. Seinfeld had no people of color. Give me a break. And now that's changing. And, I'll be long gone before this is over, but the day will come in this country that we don't discriminate because of race. But for now, we do. Implicitly, we see it. And there's many people in this world that do, and it's wrong.
All right, thank you so much. I'm seeing some new hands. Mr. Joel Sternstein, if you'd like to pose a question to the speaker.
Yeah, hi. I think it's rather sad that, Mr. Chair, I think it's rather sad that the speaker grew up that way. But again, I think the reason that she's here right now is testament to the fact that she's been able to overcome that. You can't erase the past. The past is what it is. It's happened. But I just think that we're all here because we're trying to overcome that. And okay, sure, there were only white shows in the 80s, but then there was the Cosby Show. There was Living Color. There were shows that were predominantly Black too. So again, I think we're much further along than we used to be, and I think we need to look at this positively as opposed to negatively.
I agree with you that we have come a long way, but we have a long way to go, and human beings see difference. And we're in an apartheid country. We had apartheid. And when you have things like segregated schools, segregated water fountains, during my lifetime, that's going to continue until all of me's, all of the people that were raised in a society that was so segregated and continues to be in
You
many
think
ways. We're still
in an
Please hold your
apartheid country?
comments.
no, we're not an
Please hold your
apartheid.
comments, Mr. Sternstein.
Yeah, we're not an
All right, we're gonna go.
apartheid country, but we still live in segregated because of redlining. That's changing. It's changing, but it doesn't change quickly. It's going to take decades for this to happen.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Speaker, and thank you to our questioners as well. I am now looking for another speech in the affirmative. I'm seeing Mr. Richard Antico.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having listened for an hour and 35 minutes to various points of view, it seems to me almost every speaker in their heart of hearts wants segregation and opportunity, segregation to end and opportunity to be equal, even if they couch it from the negative or from the positive, it makes no difference. Almost all the speakers, I haven't heard one person say segregation now, segregation forever, whatever. I haven't heard any of that. And so I'd like to pose a little thought experiment, somewhat akin to, was it Einstein who talked about thought experiments when he was dealing with the issues that he is so famous for? And so the thought experiment I have is, how will we know that we've come to a point where we can be colorblind, or we are naturally colorblind, as the 4 or 5-year-old that was spoken about a couple of minutes ago? How will we know that we're there? And how will we know when we're not there? And so the thought experiment has a question. And only when this question is answered by a wide range of people in the positive, will we know we've gotten there. Not in the positive, I misspoke myself. Only when the question is answered with a $0, will we know we have gotten there. And the question is, how much money would it take for the average person to be forever a person who is Black? This goes to a white person. All right, you white guy, how much money would you demand to undertake to be the rest of your life as a Black person, when the answer to that question, far and wide, is $0? We know we will have gotten there. And there was very little that was spoken about how do we know where we are and how do we know where we're going. But if you break it down to a question of dollars and cents, you can sort of, if you track it, all right, you'll be able to see whether we're improving or it's just a subjective sense that we're improving. I have the same sense. We are improving, I believe. Well, that's nice. That's a belief. But are we really? And when we see that number change, the dollar number changes in answer to the question, then we can track it and see where we are. Thank you.
All right, let's all thank the speaker. It's a very thought-provoking thought experiment. I'm seeing some hands up. Mr. Michael Balter.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if I should try to answer the question of the speaker posed, because I don't know that I have a question for him as much as an answer to his question. So is that appropriate?
Yes, I'll rule that as appropriate.
I think the question for me with the notion of colorblindness is that it's maybe I'm looking at my colorblindness, but how I will know if I'm colorblind is by asking my friends who are people of color. How are they experiencing their fact that they are racially distinct? So to me, it's my condition now, my friends who are people of color, particularly the younger generation, still talk to me about racism. So it means that for me to be colorblind is to say to them, that's not true. We're all equal. So my test, and I'd ask this of the speaker, is that I believe the way we would know is that people we are close to, who are people of color, if you ask them how's it going and they say fine, is America equal, then good. Then I would be good with that. I have no idea how to put a financial, criteria because I haven't experienced my friends of color's lives.
I'd just say to see it in dollars and cents is a tougher question. Without a doubt. Coworkers I've had that, have been from all over the world. And I'm quite sure that those folks would say that I was fairly colorblind. But to actually say, I think in this sense, I'm a racist. I wouldn't say zero today. There's just too much difficulty in the world for Black folks for me to want to say the answer to the question is zero for myself personally. All right, that doesn't mean I can't go out of my way, or that's a bad expression. I can't, in the natural order of things, treat other people humanely and decently and politely. It's my nature because I get along with everybody. And so, but I would still not answer that question as zero. And I expect in our heart of hearts, most white folks wouldn't answer that question with the number zero. I don't think the society is anywhere near that.
All right, thank you. I'm seeing some new hands here again. Mr. Whit Cook, do you have a question for the speaker that you would like to pose to me?
Yes. And again, it's in my case is just like a previous individual. I think it was Mr. Balter. It was more of a thought-provoking answer to the question that the speaker had. The question was posed: how do we know when we get to that place of being colorblind, or when we find a solution to this? So if it's in order, I'd like to speak to that.
Yep, ruled as in order.
Okay. So in this case, I'm going to use a really old argument. It's one of the oldest arguments. I haven't heard this mentioned yet. But in order for this argument to work, you have to believe in a creator, not just a creator, but a common creator. I am of the religious mindset, and I believe that I have a creator, and I believe that all of us are children of that God or creator, however anybody looks at that. With the mindset of being a child of the same creator, a whole new mindset opens up, a whole new purview, where you see each other as your spiritual brothers and sisters, if not literal brothers and sisters, where we're all equals. And it's a wonderful thing when you go into a congregation and you sit into the same pews and you all listen to the same things that are being taught and you all sing the same songs and you look at each other and you develop these relationships and friendships, and you all worship in the same value structure, and you all live the same lifestyle in a way where color doesn't matter at that point. I've experienced this countless times throughout my life, and this is coming from somebody who grew up. And if anybody here is from California, especially Northern California, you would be very familiar.
Mr. Cook, if you could just get to
Sure.
wrapping up your question here, please.
Sure. I'm pointing out that even in rough circumstances where I have experienced anti-white racism in Oak Park, in Sacramento, California, growing up in that type of an atmosphere, that the oldest argument or the oldest answer to that question is we need to find God. And it's too bad that religion has declined in our country, because it's no wonder that anger and resentment has increased as religious acceptance and attendance, religious attendance, has decreased. I don't think it's a coincidence.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry, are you addressing me?
Yep. Would you like to reply to the questioner?
Well, it's a little difficult because I grew up in a home that was openly anti-deist. All right, and I don't quite take that strong a position about it, but I am certainly a proselytizing atheist. And the reality, though, that my mind, that may be where my heart is, but my mind says that Mr. Cook is on the right side of history. What I'm saying is that in evolutionary terms, the belief systems that Mr. Cook is referring to, and that many other people on the planet, of whatever religious faith they may be, but those who believe that there's a creator and so forth, there's got to be some competitive evolutionary advantage to such belief systems, even though I myself find it abhorrent. It's been around so long, it meaning the religious belief systems have been around so long that there has to be some evolutionary advantage, or it would have died out, as Marx postulated, but was clearly wrong. And I give you that response for what it may be worth.
All right. Let's everybody thank the speaker and questioners, please. All right. I think we're going to have time for one more brief speech in the affirmative here. I'm looking at Mr. Whit Cook for a brief speech in the affirmative.
Oh, well, I kind of already used up that time for replying to the last question or speaker. So, but if I could, since I've been afforded the opportunity, I will expound on that a little bit more. So my position that I take is, like I said, of a religious nature, that those who believe in a creator, whether it's a divine creator, a spiritual creator, or if somebody refers to Mother Earth as creator and we just sprung up, and as the previous speaker had mentioned in the state of evolution, in any case, we all sprang from the same place. And while I understand the attitude of competitiveness, and I've heard it a couple of times here this evening during this debate, this discussion platform, that there is a competitive structure between the races. And my argument is that's, even though that might be the case, it doesn't mean that we have to submit ourselves to that. We should reach for a higher plane. We should reach for this understanding that once we realize a competitive nature between different cultures and different groups of people, that we can ascend from that type of behavior and attitude, that we can look to each other as brothers and sisters, that we can accept each other for our differences, and we really can move on from that. I have been a part of many congregations in a religious setting, as well as a political setting. I'm very involved in my local state and in a couple of other states that I've lived in previously, where color really didn't matter. What really matters is that we had the same ideas and we were fighting for the same things. And I think that any time when we have this tribalistic attitude or mindset, it could be redirected to a type of thought instead of a type of the way a person thinks or the way a person looks. We should look more to how a person thinks instead of how they look. I really like to look at it not as a whole bunch of different races or cultures that we come from. While we celebrate all of our differences, and we all have our preferences of finding mates and so on, as was mentioned earlier by the previous speaker, I tag that to the understanding of evolution. I think that as brothers and sisters, we can get past it with a lot of love, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of acceptance. And if anybody has been wronged, like I previously mentioned, I have every reason and every claim to be a racist because of the way that I was treated as a kid, growing up in Oak Park, suffering from a lot of anti-white racism. But instead, I choose
Mr. Cook, if you could please bring your argument to a close.
Instead, I choose a different path, and that is of love and acceptance and understanding that that some people are good and some people are bad, no matter what they look like. Thank you.
All right. Does everybody thank the speaker? I think we're going to have time for one quick question here. If anybody has a question they'd like to pose to the speaker.
I guess I did a good enough job.
Oh, wait, I think we have one.
Okay.
Miss Morrison.
I have a question, and I was like, for the speaker, I was really with the speaker until that very last thing about people being good or bad. And I just wonder if maybe under pressure from time, I just wonder if you also believe that we all have good and bad in us, and that we can just like you're choosing to rise above victimhood or previous discrimination. Would the speaker, agree that everyone has both potentials and that we can choose to a great extent, at least?
I absolutely accept that notion. And that was part of the reason why I brought it up, is that good and evil, as we claim, or you could say with the law or against the law, or however we want to frame the argument, it is within all of our natures, despite what we look like, despite how much pigmentation we have in our skin, that we can choose to live above whatever nature it is, that whatever circumstances we were born into, that we can rise above that. Yes, that was my whole premise. Thank you.
All right, thank you both again. And with that, I would like to thank all of our speakers and our final speaker, and I'm now going to ask for a motion to adjourn this debate.
So moved.
All right, thank you, Richard. And with that, this debate is adjourned.